I went into the story somewhat reluctantly. I come from a generation of scientists where it wasn't really acceptable to talk about whales' feelings or even their cultural lives and still be respected as an academic scientist. The mentality has since changed, and we know so much from research about their incredibly rich social lives and emotional lives. But I still had a little bit of this lingering discomfort inside. I was worried about coming across a little bit woo-woo and writing about the whale this way. It's not a science story. It's not in keeping, I guess, with the scientist side of myself. But at the same time, I couldn't let it go. So I just carried on, even though those were my initial feelings of, well, how am I going to tackle this?
What's up, everybody from Nautilus? I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Catherine Denardo. Catherine is a freelance writer, editor, and biologist based in Seattle, Washington, where she occasionally sees whales from the park at the end of her street. As a biologist, she researched killer whales in the Norwegian Arctic and the Pacific Northwest. And a recent story in Nautilus was the story of a lonely orca. After 53 years in captivity, she has a chance at a better life. Catherine, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, to start off, could you summarize your intellectual and academic background a bit and describe the kind of stories you've been drawn to telling as a writer?
Yeah, so I used to be a killer whale researcher, as you mentioned. I did my master's on killer whale behavior and studied a population of killer whales in northern Norway. And then when I moved to Seattle, I worked as a volunteer researcher at the Center for Whale Research in the San Juan Islands, also working with killer whales there. And I eventually moved away from fieldwork and became an editor, working on conservation stories and science stories for a magazine published out of the University of Washington. The magazine was called Conservation. I worked alongside a fantastic editor there she's still at the helm, but the magazine is now called Anthropocene. I actually never considered being a writer. I have a dear friend, Bonnie, who once asked me if I would ever consider writing, and my response was, God, no. I just want to help other people tell their stories, particularly science stories. And she chuckled and she said, well, it's probably because you haven't come across anything you want to share with the world that badly yet. And maybe she's right, because here I am telling stories about killer whales. And I feel like whether I'm editing or writing, what I most enjoy is helping tell other people's stories.
Take us back to a time when you first got interested in killer whales. What's the origin story of that passion for you?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't really remember a time when I wasn't interested in whales and dolphins. I was a youngster who grew up on David Attenborough nature documentaries, and I studied biology at university and was very drawn to fieldwork and marine mammals, and in particular their behavior. So killer whales really were sort of the ultimate interesting subject, given where my interests lie.
Hmm. All right. Once again, your new story in Nautilus is the story of a lonely orca. Could you give us a brief summary of that article for our viewers who haven't read it yet?
Yeah, so this is a story about an orca or killer whale who's been in captivity in Miami for over 50 years. Many people might know her as Lolita or Tokite. She was taken from the wild in the Pacific Northwest in 1970 when she was 4 years old. And her capture was really a brutal event, and I write about that in the story. 90 whales were corralled in this small pen that day, and 7 were captured and 5 drowned. In this story, I trace Lolita's life from the day she was captured to the present day. And she's lived her whole life in this tiny, dilapidated tank at the Miami Seaquarium, and she's now 57 years old. People have been campaigning for her about the poor conditions in her tank and fighting for her release for years. For the longest time, it's really seemed like a dead end situation. But very recently, her story took this incredible turn in a positive direction, and the people who are now caring for her are starting the process to hopefully be able to move her to a sanctuary in the Pacific Northwest in her former native habitat. So, for those of you who haven't read the piece yet, I think more than telling her life story, I think the piece probably reads a little more like an acknowledgement of what happened to her, and maybe reads a little bit like an apology for what she's lived through.
When did you find out about Lolita's story? Had you heard it, just learned about it recently, or is this something you've been aware of for a long time as a killer whale researcher?
Yeah, so I never actually planned to write about Lolita. My interest has mostly been in the wild population that she was taken from. These whales live mostly in the waters of Washington State and British Columbia, and they're known as the southern residents. They're an endangered population. There's only 73 animals left. A third of the population was taken during those captures in the late 60s and 70s. And although their numbers began to rebound once the captures ended, the population's still really struggling. So that's where most of my interest has been focused. But during my research and my conversations with other researchers and people who work with the southern residents, this captive whale, Lolita or Tokite, kept coming up into the discussions. And it became clear to me that people here had never really let her go. It was as if she was this wound that had never really healed. So, I was out on a boat once with a researcher I was interviewing, and we sped past Penn Cove, which is the cove where the capture took place, where Lolita was taken from. And he tapped me on the shoulder and pointed out and said, can you believe they've never been back here in all these years? And this was a comment that I'd heard many times. So she just kept coming up over and over in the course of my other work and other conversations.
Mm, mm. So what inspired you or give you an impetus to write about Lolita now?
Originally when I started thinking about writing her story, she was stuck at the Miami Seaquarium, like I said, and it seemed like it was this dead end situation, and that her life wasn't ever going to improve. And I was really thinking about exploring the idea of how to make peace with a wrong that could never be made right. And this was the idea that kept going around in my head. And I was thinking about wrongs, how to right wrongs, how to apologize for wrongdoings. And I started to think about what an apology to her might look like. I began reading about what makes a good apology. I read a book by Molly Howes called A Good Apology. And what I learned is taking the time to really acknowledge a wrong is a really important ingredient in a sincere apology. So even if you can't fix something or change something, a concrete acknowledgement of the wrong that's being committed is a huge part of the healing process. So that's what I was trying to do, and spent many months sort of going through this thought experiment. What's interesting is the story has evolved since then. So when I first had this idea, she was stuck there, nothing was happening, and I thought it would just be an acknowledgement of her life and what had happened. And then the Seaquarium came under new ownership, and things started to shift a little bit. And I thought, well, where is this story going now? And she stopped performing, and they didn't renew her permit for performances when the new owners took over. So then I felt like she was kind of languishing in this tank in limbo, and nobody really knew what would happen. And I wasn't sure how to pursue the story from there. And then she got really sick. And then I was worried, oh no, this story I'm working on might end up being an obituary for this beautiful whale. But Thankfully, her health stabilized, and over the past few months, she's doing much better from a clinical perspective. And then this sudden, unexpected development was announced last month. And she has this incredible chance for a better life. And it just felt like the right time to tell her story and put my words on the page. And even though, this new development is something to feel really good about and to celebrate, I still feel like no matter what happens to her, it was important to acknowledge what we'd done to her.
Yeah, and speaking of apologies, you mentioned a scene in the story where one of the men who helped capture her is speaking at some event, sort of recounting what he had gone through to do that and how much regret and shame he felt being involved. Yeah, I mean that was a really powerful, moving part of the story.
Yeah, it was very moving to hear about that event and that story. And the organizers of that commemoration event from Orca Network shared with me that that was the first time he had been back. He was from Oregon, but that was the first time he had been back to Penn Cove, where the captures happened, when he agreed to come to the commemoration event. And I think it was incredibly moving for everybody who was there to see this big, burly guy just pouring his heart out and acknowledging what had happened.
What were some of your first thoughts on how to go about writing this story once you decided, this was something you wanted to do?
Yeah, so I went into the story somewhat reluctantly. I come from a generation of scientists where it wasn't really acceptable to talk about whales' feelings or even their cultural lives and still be respected as an academic scientist. The mentality has since changed, and we know so much from research about their incredibly rich social lives and emotional lives. But I still had a little bit of this lingering discomfort inside. Yeah, I was worried about coming across a little bit woo woo and writing about the whale this way. It's not a science story. It's not in keeping, I guess, with the scientist side of myself. But at the same time, I couldn't let it go. So I just carried on, even though those were my initial feelings of, well, how am I going to tackle this?
One of the lines in your story you repeat a handful of times. Lolita gets a dead fish. What was your intention with that?
Yeah, I didn't actually have an intention when I wrote that line, even though I wrote it over and over. Part of my regular writing practice is to sit and write very detailed and accurate and concrete observations. It's called the here and now practice. So I spent a lot of time while I was thinking about her and working on this story, playing video footage of her performances, and I would write down exactly what I saw, like a sort of blow by blow replay of what I was watching. And so every time in her performance repertoire, she would do her tricks, and then she'd get a fish, and then she'd do some more tricks, and then she'd get a fish. And this was just the way the sentences came together based on what I was watching. But ultimately, in the piece, I think the repetition of that line maybe underscores to the reader that she had this repetitive, sort of monotonous life. And for me, I think it really underscores the juxtaposition between this huge, magnificent, beautiful predator that should be swimming, hundreds of miles a day, catching these, big, muscly Chinook salmon, was being fed these puny little frozen fish.
Hmm. What can you tell us about just like what you mentioned before about how there used to be culture of sort of silence or uninterest in the lives of these creatures, but nowadays it seems like people seem to be pretty familiar with how intelligent and cultured and social dolphins are. And I know killer whales are actually dolphins. That's a common misconception. So, is there any interesting things about whale culture and society that are particularly fascinating or fascinating to you, and makes these creatures so compelling to understand and relate to?
Yeah, so the southern residents, the killer whales that live here in the Pacific Northwest, that's the population that she's from, they're one of the most well-studied populations in the world, and now we know so much about them. We know that they live in these matrilineal groups, so that means the grandmother, the mother, the daughters, the sons, the cousins, they all live in one big family group for their whole life. And they learn their dialects and their language from their siblings and their family members. They share their food, they catch salmon together, they share the fish together. They have these wonderful get togethers called greeting ceremonies that are unique to this population, where all the whales in the population come together. And there's this wonderful explosion of vocalizations and sounds, and a lot of acrobatic surface behavior, and a lot of mating takes place during those get togethers. We know that they grieve for each other. There was the famous story in the news in 2018 of the mother that pushed her dead calf for 17 days. Now I think we just know so much about their lives and their family bonds, and the way they depend on each other and how they experience each other, and their emotions and their lives. So they're really incredible.
Can you tell us about any more interesting tidbits or anecdotes or ideas you came across in your reporting on this story that, for whatever reason, didn't make it into the final piece?
Yeah, one thing that maybe didn't come across so much in the final piece is just how dramatic this new development in her story is. And it's so recent. I mean, this is why she's in the news and in a bunch of other outlets, as well as Nautilus. It's been literally decades of confrontation and mistrust and inaction, and deadlock. Nothing was happening with her, and advocates kept pushing, but her situation didn't look like it was going to change. So after all this time, it's really incredible that there is this new development, and I think that's largely due to the new owners at the Seaquarium, and they seem really genuinely motivated to work with Tokite Lolita's advocates, and plan to do what's best for her. And even though that wasn't a big part of the story, it's been really wonderful to witness that as someone who's watched her story unfold over the past few years.
What do we
One,
know?
sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the other thing that didn't make it into the story, it was kind of a different story, but it is somewhat relevant to her, and it's hard not to think about her and her prospects for her future if she goes to a sanctuary without thinking about this other story. And that is the story of Keiko. Keiko was the star of the Free Willy movie,
Mm.
and he was released in he was in a marine park in Mexico until about the late 90s, and he was released into the wild, semi-wild situation. And for those of you who don't know, a group of biologists, killer whale trainers, philanthropists, an amazing group of people embarked on this epic project to return Keiko to his native habitat off Iceland. And he spent 3 or 4 years in a wild situation, and then eventually died of pneumonia. Anyway, the idea at the time was, well, there's this amazing whale, he's in captivity, it's not right. We have this opportunity to send him home, and he can reunite with his presumed family. And it didn't work out as people hoped, for various reasons that I won't go into. But he did learn to fish. He did learn, he swam in the vicinity of other whales for some of the time. But from the point of view can we take a killer whale out of captivity, rehabilitate him in the wild, and have him swim happily off into the Icelandic sunset with his family? Then the Keiko project would be viewed as a failure. But
Mm.
I'm a close friend and former colleague with someone who worked on the boat with Keiko on these excursions between Norway and Iceland, taking him out and training him and observing him as he was learning to swim free. And we've had long conversations together about what happened with Keiko and how it relates to Tokite. So, an alternative point of view to Keiko's story is, so the original goal may not have been a successful one, but there's no question that for those years he was in Iceland and Norway, he had a far better quality of life than he had at the marine park in Mexico. He lived several years in natural habitat. He had room to explore. He was physically fit and strong, and he still maintained a relationship with his human trainers. So I think as much, as far as talking about what we might have learned from the Keiko story and how it relates to Tokite, several of the same people actually who worked on the Keiko project are now working with Tokite. So they bring this wealth of experience and knowledge with them. And their hope is not to release her into the wild like they tried to do with Keiko, but to release her into a sanctuary and give her a chance to live some years with grace and dignity and have a better quality of life than she had before. And I think from a humane perspective, that's a really worthwhile goal.
What is a sanctuary exactly?
So a sanctuary, the plan they have for her currently is to build a sea pen. And I forget the dimensions exactly, but a large sea pen, I think it's maybe 2 or 3 football pitches, something like that, where she would have round the clock care and interaction from her trainers, but she would be able to range free in this area. She would be in her natural habitat, in cold water. There would be kelp. It would be salty. She would hear the sea life that's going on around her. And they would work with her there and teach her to hunt fish and monitor her well-being. And it's I think it's a good transitionary place for her, rather than sort of this bigger idea of, well, could she go free? So the sanctuary is something that they're wanting to explore.
Yeah, I was wondering what the thinking was on whether it was possible to facilitate Lolita being reintegrated with any other group of killer whales. I don't know how that would work, or whether they would just not know who she is, so they wouldn't accept her. I have no idea what
Yeah.
thinking
So
goes on in killer whales, but yeah.
yeah, it's a fabulous question, and nobody really knows. I mean, that's the wonderful curiosity here. Um, uh, they, the team that's currently taking care of her, are very open and conservative, I think, with their expectations, and talk very much about how she will be the one to lead the steps in terms of what she's ready for. But they have unique dialects and their own language, and she will probably hear that when they're in the within a few miles of her. And they have long memories and long lives and long-term relationships. So who knows? Who knows what's possible? It's going to be a really incredible experiment if she manages to get into the sanctuary and people can begin to see how it plays out.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see that is supposed to be happening. All right, to close out, do you want to tell our viewers how they can find you online? Do you have a website or any social media channels people can follow to check out your work?
So I am not actually very active online or on social media, but hopefully you'll come across my stories and they'll speak for themselves. For those interested in wanting to follow up more about Tokite, there are a couple of organizations I suggest checking out online. One is Orca Network. One of the founders of Orca Network, Howard Garrett, has been pivotal person in keeping Tokite in the public eye for decades, and they have a lot of information on their website about her. Sacred Sea is the website dedicated to Tokite from the Lumi tribe, who are very involved with her plan to come back to the Pacific Northwest and be in a sanctuary. She's very, very dear to them. They count her as a relative, so it's well worth checking out Sacred Sea. And lastly, Friends of Toki. Their website has all the health reports and news that's going on in Tokite's life.
All right, fantastic. Well, Catherine, thanks so much for talking to us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.